Great. Great. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Arina Murison. I manage the South Africa in the World project at the Institute for Global Dialogue, which is essentially endeavoring to track South African foreign policy annually and to look at what this footprint is actually having in relation to
Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Arina Murison. I manage the South African
in this particular discussion
at the Institute.
We want to explore key events from the year and to look forward to the next 10 years. Please bear with us should we experience any technical difficulty, as I did a second ago, but please feel free to also use the Q&A function throughout the meeting. We'll be running an anonymous perception poll shortly, noting what is your perception of South African foreign policy, specifically in the context of the interplay between the domestic and global events. And before kicking off our conversation and introducing my colleague Sanusha Naidu, who will be moderating the panels, I'd like to hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Philani Mthembu, for his welcome, and also just to thank the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, who are our project sponsors and partners. Philani, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arina. I hope my audio and video is fine. Thank you also, colleagues who have joined for this discussion. It really is much appreciated. I think the first thing to really state is that I think it's been quite interesting. A number of sort of reviews have come out, on South African foreign policy. I think there's a number of exciting publications that have been done by the various think tanks within the country. And I think this adds to the discussion when it comes to South African foreign policy. It tells us that there is still a very strong interest in the trajectory of South African foreign policy. And I think this is quite important. It's quite important because, just to contextualize, that in 2018, there was a review that was done on South African foreign policy. That was largely at a state level. It looked at a number of areas within the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And since that review has been done, we've had quite a number of important developments in the form of the Foreign Service Bill, for instance, being passed. That will have implications. It will have implications particularly on the building of the institutional capacity, but also on the building of the training element of South African diplomats. And I think that adds a very important layer to the discussion on South African foreign policy. So that's something that we need to be following quite closely. I think the way that the IGD has sort of approached this topic in terms of South Africa in the world is that we've tried to broaden the scope of engagement in a sense that to make sure that we are speaking to state actors, that we're speaking to non-state actors, but also that we are speaking, for instance, when we're talking about non-state actors, we're including political parties. So I think in the last few South Africa in the World events that we've done, you would see in the previous reports that there was also an attempt at looking at the foreign policy perspectives of the different political parties in South Africa. And I think this is important because we are in a time where political competition is higher, than in previous years. And it's quite important to understand what the various stakeholders are thinking. Throughout 2020, IGD has been involved in various projects related with South Africa in the world, being one of them. But I think one other really important one that I'd like to highlight is, which is very relevant to what we are doing now, is that IGD has been in the process of conducting quite a comprehensive review of not of South African foreign policy, but of the ANC's international relations. And I think this is quite important because on the one side, the state is involved in the practice of foreign policy, but the ANC as a political party is involved in international relations, party-to-party relations, building, from the linkages with progressive movements from the past. And we've really been looking at some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses, because I think we cannot escape the fact that political parties play a very important role when it comes to the shaping of policy, but when it comes to the implementation also of policy. And with that, I think one of the key things that are really becoming important is the issue of capacity. The issue of capacity to formulate policy, but the issue of capacity when it comes to also implementing policy. Another important development that sort of is underway is the issue around the funding of political parties. I think this is also a debate that we need to remain involved in and remain vested in. Because when we're talking about political parties adding, to the foreign policy landscape, it's quite important that we have sustainable ways of actually funding political parties and funding the work that they do. And we've seen that when it comes to funding of political parties from private hands, we've seen that it can lead to certain challenges within the state also. So this is just one area I wanted to highlight, that it's important to keep asking that when political parties are weak, when they have limited capacity, it also has an impact on the state. And this is something that we need to be constantly monitoring. I'd like to also just sort of reiterate what Arina said in terms of saying, we really do appreciate the support that we've had from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in terms of our South Africa in the World project. And how we've wanted to also approach it is that some of the discussions that you will hear today, some through the moderation of Sanusha, through the moderation of some of our other colleagues at IGD, will also be coming from closed dialogues that IGD has been having. Because IGD has also been having closed dialogues with a select group of scholars who are working on foreign policy. We've also tried to involve various other actors, both at a state level and at a non-state level. As I speak to you now, I know that, for instance, the Trade Union Federation, COSATU, is also having a strategic engagement on international relations. And this tells you that there is an interest in international relations within South Africa. But often a challenge is bringing all of this together, is in coordinating all of this together. We've also had challenges in South African foreign policy from one administration to another, where despite the fact that it's the same political party, you often have wholesale changes that are taking place. And this doesn't bode well for creating institutional memory. But you've also got important debates around the national interest when it comes to South African foreign policy. How do you define the national interest? Do you draw from the identity of South Africa and the constitution that it has? Or is it based on a more realist sort of framework in terms of what South Africa wants to gain from other countries? I think these are all some of the important issues that will be coming up in today's South Africa in the world. So I don't want to sort of eat into the thoughts and into the presentations that our panelists will actually be having. But I just wanted to raise, some of those issues and to thank our panelists and to thank the participants for being involved and for making themselves available. And also lastly, just to thank the IGD team who have put this together, who have worked very hard to put this together. I really look forward to a robust engagement. I look forward to a robust engagement, which, yes, is robust, but also which has, which is also conducted in an orderly fashion. And I have no doubt that this is exactly what we will get from today's discussion. So with that, thank you very much, Arina. I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Philani. So please remember to vote in our poll by the end of the session. And If you would like to do some live tweeting as well, I'll be dropping a few key handles on the chat. But to discuss what has happened this year in South African foreign policy and to also look to what is going to happen in the next 10 years, I'd like to introduce Sanusha Naidu. She is a senior researcher associate at the IGD, and she will be guiding the discussion with Gustavo de Carvalho. He is a senior researcher at the ISS, and Aditi Lal Bahadur, a foreign policy analyst, as well as a campaign manager at Crisis Action. Thank you so much, Sanusha. Over to you.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you to Palani, and good morning to all our participants, our panelists, and those that are attending and watching us live stream on YouTube. And I think, you know, this is quite an interesting way to end off the year, if not begin next year. And I think that's the juxtaposition for me, is where do we end and where do we begin? It's been an unprecedented year for you guys, Gustavo and Aditi, and I think that what I'm going to do is take much more of an interactive kind of discussion as opposed to saying having 10-minute presentations, whatever. Maybe what we'll do is we'll allow you 10 minutes to just kind of pick out what you think were the key highlights, and they always don't have to be highlights that are politically correct. They could be highlights that were politically incorrect. Things that you thought that were important for South Africa in 2020, both in terms of having to deal with a pandemic, but also having to deal with the construct and the characterization of our foreign policy from where we've been in the last couple of years to where we were in 2020. And our crystal ball gazing will come much later. And I think most of us, our crystal balls are basically on the blink. So we can't really say much. But what I also want to do is, before I go into the first kind of discussion with Gustavo, I also want to welcome the Portfolio Committee from Parliament, who have very graciously, and we really appreciate this, have made time to attend this presentation, to be able to also have the opportunity to engage with our participants and the panelists and ourselves and pick our brains on key issues, which I think as an underlying theme for this discussion is the role of Parliament in oversight, particularly along some of these issues that we've been raising in terms of our foreign policy review, but more importantly, I think the points that Palani raised in terms of the ANC's relationship in international relations and the state's engagement in foreign policy decision-making. And then, of course, the question of coordination and continuity, and we cannot ignore the question of where does the money come from? You know, so I think let me start off with you, Gustavo, and knowing that you've been tracking, following, just kind of monitoring what South Africa is doing at the UN, more broadly and more specifically its current term in the UN Security Council. I think the first question for me, and you know, this is just me, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of IGD wants to ask the same question, but the question for me is, South Africa has served now 3 terms on the UN Security Council. And how have you seen the evaluation, the change, the continuity, the shifts in terms of the way it has articulated some of the issues that align to what Palani and others have said, and also that came out in our closed discussion on Monday, and that was the values, the principles, the norms. I think the question for me is South Africa's identity as a normative actor in the UN and how much of that goes forward. So just some comments around that.
Thanks so much, Sanusha, and thank you, IGD, for another opportunity to speak at this event. This is the second time I speak at this South African in the World event, and it was precisely 2 years ago when South Africa was about to join the Council. So it's actually, for me, it's an interesting, I was looking to my notes that of my presentation of two years ago and trying to almost compare a bit of what the expectations were 2 years ago and what do we see now. And I think it's really important for us in terms of identifying what are some of the lessons that we've learned, what are some of the things that we did somehow well, but also what are the issues that I think maybe we have forgotten or we didn't do so well or we could have done slightly different. Because to some extent, I think there is a lot to do with not only how do we define those bigger priorities, but particularly what are the mechanisms and structures that we've set up to respond to those priorities. And I think what Philani mentioned and what you mentioned, Sanusha, is very important. Because the one element that we've seen is that while in 2018, a lot of the discussions around the new dawn and what would happen in South Africa, there was that usual comment around South Africa's back in the game. So just before South Africa joined the council, we did a long study with New York actors. And one of the questions we were asking them is that how visible is South Africa in the United Nations? And one of the most usual answers at that time is that South Africa is not so visual. We see them at times when it comes to discussions around the DRC. We see them at times kind of championing some issues around security sector reform, but we don't consistently really see South African voices at the table. 2 years later, of course, this is one thing that changed. By default or by design, by being in the Security Council, by being the chair of the Africa Union, it gave South Africa a platform and a voice that makes any position of South Africa in peace and security matters to be scrutinized by everyone, starting ourselves. 3 years ago, I don't even think most of us would really know what was South Africa's position when it comes to Syria. Right now, we do spend quite a bit of time trying to understand whether that position of, in principle, accepting resolutions that will come from any of the sides as a potential avenue, as something that we know more about. But I think what happened 2 years later is that we kind of starting to get a better sense of what game South Africa is playing. We know that South Africa is somehow back in the game. South Africa is willing to be more visible. And there is that management of expectations that we're possibly not as active on peace and security matters than we were 10 years ago, but we're probably not going to be as indifferent to some peace and security matters as we were 6-7 years ago. So I think that is one important thing to mention. But the other thing that happened in the last couple of years for us is this questioning around issue of planning and prioritization. And I think that it's very important because stated priorities do not necessarily lead to actual actions that we would see South Africa pursuing in foreign policy issues. Because to some extent, the big principles of South African foreign policy in multilateral organizations remain more or less the same. Africa remains central. Multilateral institutions remain important. But to some extent, when you start filtering down what those big principles are and what the implementation is probably where you find more nuanced approaches and more nuanced views of where South Africa was going. One of them is around peace and security itself, which historically, in the last 30 years, has always featured as a very important and very high in the agenda. Certainly at this stage, I would call it a priority, not the priority, especially because peace and security matters tend to be in a second or third place in relation to other responses, whether it's in terms of development. This year, of course, a very complicated year with the COVID-19 crisis and a lot of internal pressure. And those internal pressures create those checks and balances and processes that reduce somehow South Africa's appetite of being too active when it comes to peace and security matters. But that links also a bit in terms of what Philani was mentioning earlier around, and what I would call, what are some of the epicenters of foreign policy in South Africa? Of course, we often talk about DIRCO, about the South African Permanent Mission in New York, around the role of the Permanent Mission to the African Union, to the presidency itself. But it is important for us to understand some of the changes that happened in the last 2 years around the role of Parliament and around the role of the political parties themselves, and particularly the African Union. I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is probably a slightly more balanced approach between different actors. I would say a couple of years back would be much easier to see a much more dominant ANC in defining every single aspect of foreign policy in South Africa. But right now it seems a bit of a balance between bureaucracy, political actors, and so on. And it is much harder for me we often get this question asked for us about who is the main driver of foreign policy in South Africa? And to some extent, it depends. It depends on the issue. It depends on the file. And I think that it's something, and I'm really glad that IGD is looking into that, because I do think that it's something that is important for us to do. But the other challenge that I think we've seen in terms of South Africa, yes, Africa remains the centrality. Peace and security remains an important issue, but what aspects of peace and security then? And I think that is the one that it took us a bit longer to really figure out after South Africa joined the Security Council. Because the campaign and the general rhetoric of South Africa has often been that preventive diplomacy, peacekeeping, women, peace and security, youth, peace building, security sector reform, human rights. It's a kind of an issue that we may even talk separately about that. These are all major priorities. But when South Africa joined the Council, it wasn't necessarily something that we were seeing on a day-to-day basis being really what they were pursuing, which led to us to realize that first we need to identify those priorities as they are presented. We now have a sense that women, peace and security, African issues, particularly when it comes to DRC, South Sudan, Sudan, to some extent Somalia, were the main issues for South Africa. The preventive diplomacy to some extent, particularly when it comes to Libya and a lot of the push for South Africa to bring African voices. But South Africa wasn't so active when it comes to the discussion on the future of peacekeeping at large. There's been a lot of conceptual discussions around the future of peacekeeping, and not so much. South Africa wasn't so active when it comes to the peace building discussions, especially when it comes to the review of the peace building architecture. Security sector reform for me is a fascinating case, because prior to South Africa joining the Council, it was probably the priority that we would find on peace and security matters. It wasn't very visible in South Africa's term in the UN Security Council, and it seems very likely that it will be quite an important issue for South Africa's December presidency of the Council just before it leaves, which provides us this intriguing question of, is this kind of opening the space of what is going to happen from 2021, that security sector reform will once again be a major priority? But all of this kind of shows from a planning and prioritization point of view is that structures matter. And at two levels, and I think one of them, and back to Sanusha's question, is that the experience that South Africa had in the Security Council in the last 10 years matters. A lot of the actors within the South African government understand how the Security Council works, even if at least from a procedural point of view. Because we need to remember that multilateral organizations at times are as much of a high-level politics institutions as they are bureaucratic organs. So understanding how they work, how to negotiate, when to bring a resolution, when to take it out, it is a big part of the job. And having capacitated diplomats both in New York and in Pretoria to do that, we do think that it gave South Africa quite a bit of leverage. But at the same time, and it's one thing that it's a fairly new process, is how South Africa engages with the bureaucracies themselves, the secretariats, the Commission of the African Union. And we think that it's something that South Africa still could do much better. From an African Union point of view, since Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma left the role of chairperson of the African Union, we've seen historically a very small role of South Africans within the African Union Commission. For many years, the most senior South African in the Commission was the head of a division, not even a head of department, of the Peace Support Operations Division. That seems to be changing somehow, and we see that with the expectations for the new summit of the African Union in February, where a lot of the new commissioners will be elected. And for the first time, we see a very large number of South Africans actually competing for those positions, from deputy chairperson, from what we call the super commissioner of political and peace and security affairs. And to some extent, it is something that is this an expectation that we can have, that South Africa would be interested not only in terms of the more political aspects of the African Union, but also in terms of the bureaucratic aspects of the African Union? What are some of the main findings? And I'm going a bit in some of these key lessons and key findings. So if you want to interrupt and go to another question, feel free. But I do think in the previous years has been an interesting acknowledgement of where South Africa sits in the world, and particularly in terms of those multiple hats that South Africa plays. South Africa wasn't just a Security Council member. South Africa was an African member state within the Security Council, which plays a very important role in the African Union and at SADC. South Africa is part of the non-aligned movement. South Africa is part of BRICS. And those multiple identities really created an interesting space of less alliances, more case-by-case interactions. Because when South Africa joined the Security Council, we had all of those years with very tight relationship with BRICS, particularly Russia and China, and a lot of it, especially Western countries, asking, is South Africa going to be an ally to Russia and China, or will South Africa play a more independent role? And what we've seen throughout those 2 years is that this case-by-case approach really worked, often at a lot of confusion that would create at our side. And I will give a very small story around how we saw that. The first month South Africa joined the UN Security Council, we had very difficult discussions on Venezuela and on DRC. South Africa's positions were very opposing to most of the Western countries when it comes to those two countries. And many observers at that time said, well, see, South Africa is going to be voting with Russia and China. 3-4 months later, in an extremely difficult discussion on women, peace, and security, which the United States almost threatened to veto a German-led resolution due to some language on sexual and reproductive rights, South Africa was possibly the most vocal council member against the position of Russia and China, and using the idea of the rights of victims of sexual abuse victims are now being denied for the sake of compromise. And there is a point on this story. In October last year, South Africa was the president of the UN Security Council and pushed for a resolution that many of us saw as a bit diluted and maybe not advancing so much, but a resolution that really focused on the idea of implementation of agenda on women, peace, and security. Interestingly, it was a resolution that was unanimous, which brought together Russia and China. 2 weeks ago, Russia surprisingly tables a resolution on women, peace, and security, which puts many of us in this field kind of wondering why. You normally are the country that is against those types of resolutions, and South Africa voted in favor of Russia, which created the question, how much is South Africa a champion for a resolution like that? But that shows to us is that what South Africa to some extent plays a role is that, well, we had a resolution that was put forward by Russia, which is a country that we have positive relationships, is a resolution that did not backtrack any agreed language by the Security Council, and therefore we have no problems of voting in favor of that. 2 weeks later, South Africa had voted on a resolution at the General Assembly on an issue of reducing space threats, where Russia and the UK were being very vocal against each other, but South Africa voted with the UK. So all of those little anecdotal stories really show not a very clear trend in terms of alliances of South Africa, but really alliances that we've seen to be done much more on a case-by-case basis. But where South Africa gained most leverage here was where South Africa engaged with African member states. And I think that is probably the biggest success South Africa had in the UN Security Council. The A3, or the 3 African members of the Security Council, historically have been not very unified and not necessarily voting together. And the one thing that happened once South Africa joined the UN Security Council was quite a deliberate and public attempt of promoting joint statements of the A3, joint positions, and using them as leverage, particularly in discussions in Africa. We saw that in Sudan last year, where the A3, by coming together, really was able to break some of the deadlocks. On the one hand, UK and Germany, on the other hand, Russia and China. Not always that was possible, and we had in many circumstances the A3 not being able to vote together. WPS resolution was one of those, but also in some especially when we have issues related to the Sahel, where there is often more divides. But that has been a very important aspect of increasing the role of Africa as an agent within the Security Council. Sanusha, just wanted, how long do I still have to speak, sir? I don't want to go too much overboard.
I want to say 1.5 minutes.
Let me just use that to just conclude some thoughts so I can give the floor to Aditi and maybe some of the issues we can discuss more in the Q&A. But just very briefly then, so I mentioned about the capacity and structures, the different epicenters of foreign policy, the way of a case by case, but also how thematic areas, thematic areas that South Africa saw with much importance. I mentioned WPS, I mentioned the role of the A3, but one really important area for South Africa was UN-AU relations. Historically, is probably the most consistent thematic area for South Africa in the Council, because since South Africa first joined the Council in 2007, this has been always the flagship initiative, whether in terms of bringing together, creating new mechanisms, but particularly at the moment of ensuring there is a continuation of council-to-council relations. Another issue that was quite interesting and possibly not much surprises for us in South Africa, but sometimes surprises for those outside, is a very heavy presence of what we call ideological topics. So those topics that have some kind of an emotional attachment to South Africa, often because of its own history or relationships and so on. And the way that South Africa voted was very much in line with those. Israel, Palestine, Venezuela, Western Sahara, for me, are the three most visible ones. And we have to see them within those eyes of issues that historically have an ideological and or emotional role. The most tricky one, I think, for South Africa was how to deal with non-African issues, which historically wouldn't necessarily be much of the engagements. And that's where I think South Africa very much used this more low-key approach and on this idea of a case by case. Syria is an example where South Africa's main point of view would be that we would vote in favor of any resolution that creates the possibility of opening humanitarian corridors, whether it's a resolution that is coming from Russia, whether it's a resolution that is coming from the P3. And that it's created a bit of an impression of South Africa being a bit on defense when it comes to that. But it certainly, for me, was a way of avoiding a lot of spillover effects on its own main priorities. Where to go, and I will do that in 30 seconds and possibly just as a points for discussion. I really wanted to use the cheesy view of like, I don't know what it's going to happen in the next 10 years because I don't have Vision 2020, but that is really cheesy. So, but I think the two aspects for me when it comes to multilateralism, the first one, AU. I think with South Africa leaving the UN Security Council, there's going to give a very strange sense of identity of we're not that important anymore when it comes to January 1st. For 2 years, every single global strategic issue South Africa was involved with. And a really good way, I think, for me is to actually be more engaged with the African Union. And for me, particularly joining the AU Peace and Security Council for a 3-year mandate would be of absolute importance. I think if they want to continue highlighting the role of the UN-AU relations, they need to do that from within. The role of the Commission and engaging more with the reforms is something that is very important, and particularly reflecting a bit in terms of the chairship and some of the successes and failures. I think that it's how separated that we could discuss. And on the UN is a similar process. Priorities, identify what your priorities are. They won't be the same as they were in the Security Council. But countries that tend to be very successful after they leave the Council, they tend to do two things. They document and reflect their main successes and failures very soon after, because they help shaping the narrative and the discussions with a broader society in terms of what they did and what they didn't do. But second, it allows them that the prioritization process doesn't just happen within the Security Council when they are there, but it also allows them continuity, because otherwise they will be seen as tourists. They joined the Security Council for 2 years, they left, and we don't remember anything they did. Certainly issues around WPS, African files, future of the peace operations in the DRC would be very important. But I do think there is a lot of opportunities for South Africa to be more engaged in the peace building agenda of the United Nations, and especially if security sector reform is going to come back as a major priority for South Africa, they need to be quite clear in terms of what really the goals that they're willing to play. Anyway, I spoke for too long, and I will thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Every time, Gustavo, when we listen to you, we get more and more, I think, excited about the UN and excited about the multilateral. Before I get to Aditi, I mean, I think you raised fundamental points, and you've got a whole lot of questions in the Q&A box, if you can see. But we'll come back to that. Maybe you can just start percolating some of them at the moment, particularly in terms of, it's December. and South Africa is going to be serving in its last month as a non-permanent member. What should be its agenda? I mean, this is the question coming from, I think it is Sia Tokoza, about the role of diplomats and what will be the role of diplomats and the capacity of South Africa to move beyond this very interesting term called predetermined issue warrior. Never heard that one before, but it looks very interesting, like a movie. And to my mind, the idea of interest and how much of alliances play a role. Maybe if I could just play devil's advocate as well and add to that, are there issues that South Africa feels it can move on, which are really issues around women, peace, and security? But when it comes to those issues that are much more complex, maybe there's a little bit more difficulty in terms of trying to influence what Jana asks in terms of the role of China and Russia in South Africa's rearview mirror, and how that plays a role in influencing some of the bigger, the more systemic and the more systematic questions around complexity, ambiguity. I mean, things where your geostrategic interests are much more at play than, for say, I'm not downplaying the women, peace, and security proposal, but it just seems to me that there's the interesting way in which you align on a case-by-case basis and the themes and so forth. And of course, I can't help but ask, should South Africa, I mean, there's a question also by Luanda, who asked about, Minister Pandor and what she's talking about in terms of South Africa should be pushing post-December around the Ezulweni consensus of reform. But I think there's a bigger continental or security issue at play in the continent, i.e. Ethiopia. What do we do there? How do we deal with that in terms of what are the spillover effects there and how the bigger actors will come into play? And, some of these questions around South Africa wanting to have field four candidates for the AU doesn't mean, as you rightly pointed out, that South Africa feels now it needs to take on a much more explicit and visible role, manage what it is seen as some of the tensions or some of the weaknesses and institutional weaknesses of the AU. And we'll come back to the AU and South Africa's role there, but just fielding 4 candidates and thinking, maybe now I need to be, I need to take in a higher leveraging role in that context. What does this mean in terms of being a stronger actor, not just in the UN, but a stronger actor in AU? So these are some of the questions, just to think about it, and then we'll come back to you. So now we'll get to Aditi. I think there's Aditi. Aditi, you and I have been discussing and chatting over a period of time, I think it's a decade and a little bit more. And your experience in South African foreign policy and understanding, one of the things I remember very clearly we had a fascinating chat on was the question of perceptions and perceptions of South African foreign policy. I see now you've crossed over into the advocacy world, which is, again, an important space in terms of the point that Gustav was making was who drives foreign policy. So if you're in the advocacy world, you need to know where you need to ask the questions, who you need to ask, and how you need to get the issues going forward in terms of the foreign policy community that exists in South Africa. I don't think there's a single community. There are very various communities of South African foreign policy. And where do these spaces lie? Whether, as Palani said, is it an ANC international relations or is it the state foreign policy? How do you get these dynamics going forward? But just from where you are sitting, and given the fact that you're working on key issues of human security, human rights, questions of refugees, displacement of people, conflict that is not just about intrastate conflict, but with regional spillovers, but conflict that's also now what we need to start recognizing as climate change conflict, climate change refugees. Just some of your perspectives on the issues that you see going forward, and what, I mean, in terms of your reflection this year, and how South Africa is perceived as a normative actor, but also bearing in mind that we are in a state where there seems to be a kind of need to look for leadership on these issues. And where does South Africa play that role within that context?
Thank you, Sanusha. Thank you, IGD, Pilani, Arina, for this fantastic opportunity to speak with you all. I always love sharing a panel with Gustavo, but then I'm so intimidated by his incredible knowledge and expertise. So to follow on from that really amazing, detailed sort of presentation on South Africa and the Youth Security Council is just fabulous. So thank you again. And I think you know, it's not an easy task, I think, to grapple with this issue of where South Africa sits in the world, where South Africa is going. And I have to say that when I sat down to reflect upon the lessons that South Africa has learned over the past few years, it really kind of hit me that in some ways the meme verse has been absolutely spot on, right? Like the 2020 in many ways has been a decade in and of itself. Quite apart from the fact that I think we're all super exhausted and we feel like we have to dig deep into our reserves to kind of haul us across the line to the 31st of December. I think this year has been the crystallization of how powerful the unforeseen can be in changing the fundamental ways that we live, that we work, that we play. And in many ways, the dramatic turn of events of 2020 has exposed a lot of our weaknesses. You know, my mom will say, our chickens are coming home to roost. And that you're seeing that the people or the institutions that have been succeeding have been the ones that have been able to pivot quickly to adapt to the changes of the environment. And I think we're seeing that the dominance of this idea of resilience, what does it take to build resilient societies? Because they are the ones that are most capable of reacting or adapting to unknown changes in the world. It's taken us back to questioning things like, what are the very basic things about what it is our society is made up of? How healthy are we? How free are we? How prosperous are we? So healthcare, education, food security, energy security, infrastructure, these are the basis of our ability to be able to pivot and to respond to the unforeseen. Our ability to embrace technology, as we're doing right now in this webinar, as we're doing in the sort of proliferation of e-commerce in South Africa, and doing this all in very sustainable ways has really come into focus this year. And I think it's more so because we're being reminded of the fact that this pandemic is in many ways a precursor to a much bigger climate emergency that our planet is like hurtling towards. And we're in real danger if we don't make significant changes and we don't do it quickly. So I think I wanted to maybe just before I get into the sort of perceptions from my particular sort of position working in the humanitarian space, I wanted to actually sort of talk a little bit about just do a brief assessment, because as you've said, I've been an analyst for 10 years in the foreign policy space to really interrogate what are our chickens, how are they coming home to roost, what has happened in the past decade that has influenced South Africa's foreign policy trajectory and its standing in the world. And I think I want to start at possibly the most obvious and the most pervasive and for me the most demoralizing, I think, is the sort of proliferation of this information of corruption that is taking place, that has taken place in South Africa. Quite apart, I think, from the fact that it constitutes, in my mind, a betrayal of our government and our civil servants and our leadership, of South African citizens. That has resulted, I think, in the loss of about 1.5 trillion rand, money that we really need right now. These scandals have a very corrosive effect on our soft power. It contaminates the perceptions internationally and continentally that we can lead by example. This is a fundamental tenet of how South Africa has engaged in the world post-democracy. So, I mean, questions are now being raised about why should we follow South Africa? We already, especially in Africa, there's a skepticism about our mercantilist sort of intentions to sort of exploit the rest of Africa. So when current countries see that manifestation happening domestically, it kind of further fuels that level of skepticism, that level of it erodes that soft power that South Africa's had. I think importantly, domestically as well, is leading to an increased sense of disaffection among South Africans. And I think the further we get away, we spoke about this yesterday, Sanusha, the further we get away from 1994 and that the narrative and the power of that, the liberation narrative, the power of that freedom becomes less potent. And South Africans are starting to demand and expect more. we're seeing this manifested, I think, in the disarray that our politics is experiencing at the moment, our political parties are experiencing at the moment. The factionalism of the ANC, the confusion of the DA, and I think the rise of populist sentiments like that of the EFF, who actually, in my current dealings, I'm realizing has a remarkable following in the rest of Africa, particularly because of the way that they're so vocal on issues of xenophobic violence. And I think that's the second issue that I want to sort of bring up is the unabated xenophobic violence and how that is impacting on how South Africa is continued to be received in the rest of the world. And I know I've had disagreements with the South African government and in the past on whether this is xenophobic violence or it's just criminality. They kind of downplay it. And even though I disagree with their reasoning, I think that's actually also irrelevant. The fact is that this xenophobic violence this violence is being perceived as xenophobic in orientation. And that perception then influences South Africa's ability to play a leadership role on the African continent. It plays a role in how South Africans are received in the rest of the world, and particularly in Africa, sorry. I think we don't talk about it quite as much anymore because the zeitgeist is kind of like past, but it's actually really also over this past few years, what has emerged is this growing sense of inequality that is now becoming intolerable to many South Africans. We saw this taking a root, I think, or coming to a head in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, in the Fees Must Fall kind of movements that have taken place. And those speak to like our patent inability to address the growing inequality of our own country, and is leading to an increasing instability, and also sort of really detracting, I think, from our bandwidth to be able to project a global or a sort of a bigger leadership role globally and internationally. And I think, Gustavo also alluded to it when he was speaking about it, but it really is it's if you're focused on stomping out fires in your own backyard, our bandwidth is limited. So naturally there's a limited ability to be able to project the kind of power or the kind of vision that I think we really sort of captured so well in the era of Mbeki's African Renaissance, where we were leading the sort of transformation of all of these continental and regional bodies. I think if we have to look at insecurity in the region, if we consider how protracted the crisis in Zimbabwe has become, also more immediately how responsive the region and South Africa is to the growing insurgency in Mozambique, we really don't have to look far to see how inadequate our responses have become on leading in peace and security in the region, let alone on the continent. I think our apparent inability to respond to these issues is manifesting in a lack of clarity on foreign policy. So to answer this question about who leads on foreign policy, who makes the decisions, I will say, I think I'll join the chorus in saying that it is actually, it's not clear. We're relying on an outdated 2011 foreign policy white paper on, the white paper on Ubuntu to provide guidance on what South Africa's sort of priorities should be. There's a sense of distance from the interests of ordinary South Africans. There's an obfuscation of who it is that takes foreign policy decisions, what institutions are the most responsible, who are the people that take these decisions. All of this perpetuates the notion that South Africa's foreign policy is elitist. It's disinterested in the human security interests of its citizens, of the citizens of the continent, of the citizens of its regions, and that it serves to prop up the elitist, disinterested governments on the continent. And there's several crises at the moment, and really, when I was looking at this, I thought, yeah, I'm being lazy because I'm just looking at the past 2 weeks, right? And sort of saying, the crisis, the insurgency in Mozambique that is by all intents and purposes has the elements of becoming intractable if it's not dealt with swiftly and comprehensively. All the experts are talking about the fact that this could be, this has the elements of a Niger Delta, of a Cabinda, and of a Sahel, and the region remains silent. South Africa remains silent and kind of holding on to these notions of sovereignty, of subsidiarity, it really is showing the cleavages and the sort of disconnect between the values that we espouse on the one hand, entrenched in our Constitution, entrenched in our Bill of Rights, for me encapsulated very simply in the concept of human security, and then these other sort of identities that we play, the role of us being, furthering multilateral, a multilateral agenda, furthering, sort of having this international solidarity with the global South, et cetera, et cetera. Other tensions I think that I want to sort of flag are, the sort of escalating tensions in Ethiopia, the sort of escalating crisis between the Anglophone and the Francophones in Cameroon. Nigeria recently had their sort of, had a whole sort of, a whole lot of instability around the government crackdown of protesters. Guinea had contested elections. The Sahel continues. And do I still have to talk about Zimbabwe? It's still there, right? Zimbabwe persists. And for me, the question then remains, where is African leadership? Where is South African leadership? I think we have to acknowledge that we can't be all things to all people, especially now in the time of COVID, where we're not able to respond to everything. We never have been. But now increasingly strained resources are becoming even more constrained. And there's a natural pull towards shoring up our economy, ensuring some kind of economic recovery. But in my opinion, I think what the South African government really needs to consider is that even in the space of sort of economic recovery, what is really important is the imperative to be creative, adaptive, to seek different ways of working. And I think there needs to be a bigger openness and more frank engagement on what South Africa is capable of doing, where it has specific interest in doing that. So how do we come that inherent disconnect that I spoke about earlier between the values of sovereignty, subsidiarity, and how we pursue the values that we've put forward in our Bill of Rights and in our Constitution? These often stand in the way, I think, of us stopping the loss of innocent life, and of us, and then actually sort of lead to the needless perpetuation of violence. I think in addition to the robust, frank assessment of South Africa's foreign policy and benchmarking this against, I think, what we consider to be our national interest, testing this among civil society voices, there's a real need for a coordinated, consistent interpretation of what our constitutional values are, how we project these on the international stage. What institutions do we build to govern this? Or do these institutions already exist, and how do we then empower them to be more responsive? I think to do this effectively, South Africa must take the biggest lesson from 2020, to be adaptable, flexible, and innovative. I think there's a vibrant civil society community, a very active diaspora community, and a very sort of prolific academic community, all of whom are eager to engage government to help tackle some of these really big and burgeoning foreign policy issues, peace and security issues, not just in Africa, but actually all over the world. I think for government to tap into that, one key change must happen. We must stop being seen, the government stops seeing civil society and these actors as in an adversarial role, right? And I say this very sort of personally, as somebody who's built my career in this space, in the civil society space, I really can attest to the fact that in questioning government, in sort of problematizing its actions, I'm doing it from a very patriotic rationale, right? I want to make South Africa a better country. I want to help South Africa achieve the values, the altruistic values that we've set out in our Constitution. I want us to live up to the ideal, to the promise that that Nelson Mandela and the liberation movement stood for. So I want to advocate for a more concerted effort to be made to fully and comprehensively tapping into these opportunities, not just in a piecemeal kind of sporadic way. We've seen this, I think, in some of the engagement of certain government officials and certain government departments. I think Gustavo can speak a little bit about the role that the close engagement that he's had with DIRCO in the UN Security Council. But I think it has to go beyond that. I think it has to become a mainstreaming of information gathering systems. There has to be a more systemic sort of everyday engagement that goes beyond just the public speeches of principles and the political will that they express. And so that we internalize a more sort of collaborative working environment and tap into the willingness of all of these dozens of academics, CSOs, think tanks, advocacy organizations from the diaspora and from within South Africa. So let me end there.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much, Aditi. I think you've opened up an important point about looking beyond the state. I think very often the idea is that as much as the state is the central actor and the state actor in decision making, there are spaces where perceptions from outside of these formal structures of bureaucracy do play a role. As you were speaking, I was thinking, imagine if we had to ask people about what South Africa's role should be in the region in terms of whether there's any space for South Africa to deal with Mozambique or deal with Ethiopia or deal with the Sahel or whatever. What would be the impression? And how much of this is also the fact that maybe 20 years, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have DSTV that basically flooded everybody's living rooms in Africa about what's going on in South Africa. But it seems to me now that this has become an important, valuable space of information where people in the continent, or rather, let me not be as divisive as that, other countries and other populations in other countries are watching what's happening in South Africa. And so the idea of trying to say that we can manage that space of information flow, I think is becoming much more difficult, because when I started off 25 years ago, the big soft power for South Africa was our soap operas, Generations and so forth, Igoli and so forth. And that was what we would, people were watching. Now I think it's about what's happening in our domestic affairs and how much of that plays a role in the perception of the kind of South Africa, this kind of footprint or identity South Africa has in the region. But we have 13 questions, and I'm not going to try and summarize them or whatever. But what I'm going to do with perhaps Irina can allow me some guidance here is to actually ask the participants who are asking the questions to lump their to come in and ask their questions live to you and to Gustavo, so they can, I don't miss out anything and lost in translation kind of approach, but definitely raise the questions in terms of what is it that they want to explore with you and the kinds of issues that you've raised. So I'm going to start with Yana. Yana, I'm going to unmute your mic. If you can be as succinct as possible with your 3-4 questions, and if you have any specific speaker or one speaker, go ahead.
Thanks, Sanusha. It's really great to participate in this conversation. Thanks, Gustavo and Aditi. I think they've answered my first 2 questions, one which was around the perception of South Africa voting its vote at the UN Security Council and the fact that there have been perceptions that they're influenced by Russia and China. I think Gustavo covered that well. And my second question was on who do we approach and engage with in South Africa on the agenda of protection of civilians. And I'm really brokenhearted with the very explicit answer that Aditi has given us, that literally it's like not clear who. And for a critical country as South Africa to not have clarity on that question, it's really, I think, something that really needs to be worked on. I think the question I've added in there now is maybe a lot more specific. There are a lot of situations that are really blazing right now: Mozambique, Ethiopia, and recently the Sahrawi situation that has emerged. And I wanted to ask that, could we test this? And so my question is, given that, for instance, South Africa has come out very clearly on its support for the people of the Sahrawi and has argued strongly against Morocco's admission, for instance, to the African Union. And now that Morocco has provoked the situation, and now we have a situation that has fled up into an active conflict, And South Africa still has this advantage role of being chairperson of the African Union for a few more weeks, and is still in the UN Security Council, and will have the opportunity to be a rotational president next month. Is it romantic of me and unreasonable of me to think that South Africa can actually be engaged to take on this agenda that's just flared up and do something, lead the world literally on a decisive position and action in these last couple of weeks? Thanks, Anusha.
Thanks, Yana. I'm going to take another question, another two questions, so you guys have a bit of a group of questions. I think the other person I want to call upon is Sietokoza. Maybe you want to ask your question as well. Let me just unmute your mic. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Sanusha. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm just gonna read what I wrote in the question and answer box. Basically, the first question is to Gustavo, and I basically just said, where does he see the capacity to SA to move beyond being the predetermined issue or warrior that I mentioned, and more of a proactive of sort of South Africa, who has own interests which move beyond it having alliances, let's say, with Russia and China, and gives and in terms of who gives most aid to the country. So, and then I was also, a follow-up question was on South Africa not falling into the trap of exposing its own policy inconsistencies, right? Being part of a multicultural, multilateral sort of environment, which has these different issues that come up most of the time. And my second question was to Aditi, I think. I think she was talking a lot about 94 post-democracy being sort of a disappointment because we've moved from those initial normative dispositions. And I was just trying to ask her, like, what needs to happen for anyone to actually say, okay, we've tried that sort of a route, let's rather try a different sort of route now. What needs to happen? Do we need to see more disappointments? Do we need to see more sort of clear violations of what we've had written down as our guiding principles? And then last question, having been on seeing that these issues are not new, can we, or are we justified in believing that South Africa's diplomats can change the way that they do things? Because it has been a long while of them, not really continuing with their policy goals, not them acting out what they say they will be acting out. So those are basically my questions.
Sorry, I should have asked, just to give us a brief affiliation of where you're based.
No, right now I'm just a postdoc at Wits University. So
okay, thank you.
Based.
Lovely. Can we have Luanda?
Thank you so much, Sanusha, and thank you to our remarkable speakers, really. That was most illuminating and thought-provoking. So I posed two questions on the Q&A.
Sorry, before you go on, just where you're based and
Sorry. I'm based in Johannesburg with the South African Institute of International Affairs. So I posed two questions to both speakers, and the first one to Gustavo was piggybacking on the idea that South Africa's priorities might change post-December after it leaves the Security Council. So just trying to link that to something that the minister had said in a public lecture, on how South Africa needs to move forward on the Ezulwini consensus. So my question was, does he agree with this approach? And is it the best priority for South Africa post-December? And to Aditi, South Africa is often criticized for lacking a strategy on peace and security in the region. But it's evident that there aren't enough resources to be everything to everyone. I think you also mentioned this. But with this in mind, what should South Africa be prioritizing in the region in peace and security? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give it back to Gustavo and Aditi. So you've got some serious questions there to respond to. I don't know who wants to go first, Gustavo or Aditi.
I can very simply, very quickly, Gustavo, to respond to Luanda, using my newfound hat as sort of in the humanitarian space. I think I can answer this quite unequivocally. I think absolutely Mozambique in the region, like Mozambique is so worrying, right? It is a conflict that has been escalating since 2017. It's initially started in 2017 and at that time it was just unexplained violence. Like we couldn't understand what was happening. It was just this weird sort of bizarre sort of series of events. And it's only in January this year that there was this sort of confirmation that this is actually now sort of Islamic insurgency inspired, I will say. I don't think it's necessarily that, but and that has kind of cast a light on what's actually taking place in northern Mozambique that is so worrying. Just from the humanitarian concern, I think that's one thing that is just obviously escalating, but it's just a whole cocktail of contributing factors that have led to the point that Mozambique is where it is. It happens that, the violence happens to be taking place in a very remote part of the country. It's so far up north that, a country that previously has, just emerged from like 30 years of civil war. That area, Cabo Delgado, is so far removed from Maputo, from the center. And so much of it is ungoverned space. Institutions of authority like police, army are so under-resourced and so overwhelmed. What's happened is that you see a proliferation of illicit trade that's taking place. So, wildlife, drugs, trafficking, everything is happening in that region. And then that is compounded by the fact that it is now sort of the land adjacent, or the sea adjacent to the land is actually where they've discovered like the world's 4th largest oil, LNG reserves, gas reserves. So there's massive investments into the infrastructure that is there in terms of extracting that gas, but nothing that is actually filtering down to the people on a sort of who have already so significantly marginalized. So I do think that is that for me first is absolutely the one crisis that we need to address, principally because I think all of these elements make it so that if it is not contained and if it's not addressed in time, it really has a potential to spill over to the rest of the region. And I mean, ISIS in June already made a direct threat, to South Africa in response to, to developments in Cabo Delgado. So it's, we're already in that purview. So we really do have to do something. And I understand that our resources are constrained. And I understand that we are waiting, I think, for Mozambique to approach South Africa from a protocol perspective. But I think there has to be a lot more sort of proactive engagement from the part of government in actually figuring out how to lead, if not itself, a regional or a continental approach to resolving Mozambique. So I'll answer that and I'll think about the other ones and then just maybe hand over to Gustavo.
Thanks, Aditi. And thanks for all of these questions. I feel that I would need like 4 hours to just touch on the first one, but I know that it's not possible, so I won't try my luck. Now, I think these are fascinating questions. And first of all, Aditi, thanks for your presentation. I thought it was really inspiring. There's been some of the questions, they talk a little bit about this kind of final stretch of South Africa as a chair of the African Union, as the president, or finishing the Security Council mandate, being the president in December. And I think that it's a very important one because in a way, both are a bit of a reflection of how South Africa has engaged with those organs in the South African case in the last year, in the AU, but also in the case of the Security Council the last 2 years. The one thing I think we do need to tame our expectations a little bit. And I think it's important that we don't overplace expectations of what South Africa can actually do. First of all, as the chair of the UN Security Council, there is a certain degree of control a country has. Even last year in October, when South Africa was the chair, there is a number of discussions that are predetermined. There is a number of issues that fall completely out of the control of the chair. So for next month, there are certainly some big discussions that are pre-scheduled to be held in the council. The most important one for South Africa will be the expiration of MONUSCO, or the UN mission mandate in the DRC, which a lot of the discussions around drawdown and South Africa had playing a very important role since the late 90s is something that we can expect. Issues around thematic areas, I honestly don't expect something really major, partially because if you want to do a groundbreaking outcome document, whether it's a resolution or a presidential statement, it's much harder to take risks at your last month. Because for countries that are either you're a non-permanent member that will continue in January, or particularly if you're a P5 member, that a big part of your power is the permanence. It's the fact that you're always in the Security Council. It's really easy for you to just push a discussion out of the council and bring that again in January or February, which means South Africa will be out. So I think generally December tends to be, from a big outcomes point of view, especially for those countries that are leading, tends to be quite underwhelming. And I would be very surprised if we see a major resolution or a major presidential statement in some of the areas. But I think it's part of the way, I think, and maybe linking to the issue of capacity, is the way also that South Africa has played this idea of risk taking. And I think South Africa was very selective on the types of risks they were willing to take. South Africa certainly took much more risks in the position they took in Venezuela. For my personal opinions, for two reasons. One, it plays within a domestic drive and an understanding of the linkages between a revolutionary regime in Latin America, left-leaning regime in Latin America, and very similar principles to what the ANC has historically portrayed. But the second and most important one, South Africa could take that risk, because South Africa by no means is a mover and shaker in Venezuela. By no means South Africa is a major player when it comes to that. So I see there is a question that was asked there by Susanna in terms of how does it link to the relationship with the rest of Latin America? Partially, it has nothing to do with the Security Council, but with the fact there is an increasing right-wing governments being elected all over Latin America. And that in itself affects the way in which South Africa engages with the continent. So I think the issue of risk-taking, it's very much part of that, because to some extent, we can see South Africa taking more risks in Venezuela, but we don't see those same risks being taken, for instance, in accepting Cameroon of being a discussion in the UN Security Council. And I think we mentioned a lot about Mozambique and Ethiopia, but we should not forget there is a huge demand for Cameroon to be included in the agenda of the Security Council already for a number of years. There is a higher politic reason for that, and there is something that I think that South Africa missed a bit of the opportunity. From the higher political, geostrategic, and whatever fancy words we want to use, relates to the fact that it's generally really hard to bring new files within the council agenda. It's just really difficult. It's something that it tends to be blocked way before like a discussion is done. I know even with Cameroon, some creative ways of bringing the issue were done, like in the ad hoc working group on conflict resolution in Africa, where they started discussing about Central Africa, and that is already an informal group where they informally presented Cameroon, and even then was very hard. So I think it is something that African member states are often quite underwhelming of bringing new issues, unless the situation was already so difficult or so high that there's nothing you can do. And I think, honestly, I have very little faith that we're going to have a major breakthrough in the council in December around that. The other issue I think is around the role of the chair of the African Union, and Liesel Ovondren from the ISS is publishing tomorrow a really fascinating piece on South Africa's chairship of the African Union. So I think if you wait into tomorrow, you can read a lot of those things when she publishes it. But there is one very interesting analysis for me, is in the sense of South Africa's chairship to the African Union was certainly far more visible when it comes to the COVID-19 response, and kind of to some extent standing up to the occasion and bringing countries together, and quite fascinating approaches. But a lot of the previously stated priorities when it comes to silencing the guns, when it comes to this kind of even women, peace and security, that was something very present in there. It was something that never really became very present, and probably the most underwhelming part of it. For me, it's partially the role of the chair of the African Union. I think we often put much more expectations in it than what the chair can actually do. So I think taming our own expectations to what the role of the chair can actually do, what is their role. But also to some extent, it is South Africa's willingness of taking risks at those particular spaces. And it was quite clear that South Africa wasn't willing to take that many risks. COVID was safer bets, and I think it gave South Africa a lot of credentials in terms of pushing for coordination, and validly so. I don't think it's something that we should ever take away, the fact that South Africa did a pretty good job on that area, but almost very conveniently moving away from other very critical discussions when it comes to that. Just very briefly on the issue of capacity and of South Africa itself, and I think that is an interesting case, because we spend a lot of time asking this question in our interview of what makes a country successful in the Council or in the AU, and we started very much, maybe it's the size of the missions. Maybe if a country can have 30 people in New York or in Addis, they have so many people that can follow the different files that they're possibly very good at that. And there is an element of that. Having more money allows you to deploy more people and to focus on issues more specifically. But not only, because there's often this one thing that we heard very frequently, is that having quality diplomats, it's key. And I think South Africa, to some extent, is able to do that. South Africa often has very well-trained diplomats in multilateral issues. And in many of the times that South Africa is a bit more effective, tends to also have a lot to do with the individuals. The one problem South Africa still has, and I think a lot of the discussions this year around the Foreign Service Bill and so on, is about how to create an enabling system for those individuals to then perform. And I think that's often, it's a bit more problematic. Less from a decision-making point of view, more from a day-to-day point of view. A good example is South Africa in the Security Council. South Africa knew for at least a year before that they will most likely be in the council. They were not campaigning against anyone else. The elections for the council were in June, but from January, when the AU endorsed their candidacy, they knew they will most likely be there. Despite that, the mission in New York was only complete around April, May in 2019, meaning that for the first 5 months where South Africa was in the council, a lot of key files were underrepresented within the South African mission in New York. And that matters because you have less people following those issues, you have a slightly more rushed approach. It also means that the critical time where South Africa was observing the council procedures from October 2018 to December 2018, a lot of the people that were actually following that were due to come back to South Africa in December. So that understanding of the dynamics and procedures, and those things matter. And I don't think this is necessarily the fault of the individual diplomats that were there, but certainly that our system to enable those fast deployments and the fast systems be able to be done, not just in Security Council. I think South Africa should be expected to be in the council again fairly soon, considering the size and stature. South Africa is a country like Japan or Brazil or Germany or India that often is in the council and should often be in there. Final quick comments then when it comes to reform. Should we be pushing for reforms of the UN Security Council now? My feeling, I'm a bit cynical when it comes to Security Council reform, so I think my answer is a bit to do with that. I don't think it harms for South Africa to pursuing that, and I think it is actually, it's a way of reinforcing that view that if multilateral institutions do not reflect global realities and global balance of power, they will become irrelevant. Do we have a momentum where there is do we have a new 2006? 2006, that was big when the Eswini consensus and the G4, and there were a lot of that work that was being done. Probably not. And I think there is countries that you see, countries like Germany, like Brazil, like India, they're always going to be pushing for it. But are they really going to be pushing all of their political capital to ensure that this reform is going to happen and at some time soon? Probably not. And I think that it's the balance that we need to find here, is that by identifying ways in which the continent can continue engaging with that is important, but try to find new triggers that may elevate the likelihood of serious reform discussions to happen, also very important. But I think also to identify other ways in which that multilateral organizations can be reformed beyond just the representation in the Security Council. And I think that is also important too. There's a number of reform processes happening at the UN level when it comes to departments, when it comes to management, when it comes to a number of different things. And I do think that it's something that countries like South Africa should be more involved in understanding how those structures that are created to help us as member states to better respond to global challenges can be more fit for purpose and can be better responsive to the needs that we have. And I find South Africa often very quiet when it comes to that. The reforms at the UN level are far from being complete. We've seen a few mergers of departments, creation of new functions and so on. But from a management point of view, human resources and all of those things matter. They're not just bureaucratic issues. But particularly at the Africa Union level, where we're going to start seeing from February next year some of the results of the Africa Union. The most visible one, I think, is what we're seeing now in terms of the elections of the new commissioners. And I do think it does showcase some degree of interest from South Africa, but also particularly what is going to happen to one of the most powerful structures of the Africa Union, that is the bureaucracy of the Peace and Security Department. The Peace and Security Department of the Africa Union, to some extent, gained a whole identity of its own as this ability of responding and adapting to things, partially because for 10 years, it had an almost unaccountable role to member states of crafting partnerships, developing issues, developing programs, fundraising, and doing all of those things in a way that at some point member states realized, like, wait a second, this is still a political institution and we want to take the power back. And we want to kind of remain in that role. And South Africa, if it wants to be more influential in the way that it structures, it has to be more engaged on the day-to-day affairs beyond the Permanent Representative Council, beyond the Peace and Security Council, beyond the summit. But on a daily basis, be able to have first its own nationals being deployed there, but also understanding what the future role would be. Once again, I think I overstayed my welcome and spoke too much.
Nope, you are forgiven, Gustavo, because you've given us some really good food for thought. Aditi, you wanted to have one more response, and then we'll come back to the participants.
Sure, but it's just to maybe just point out, oh, Luanda's gone, her mic was on. I think I just wanted to briefly respond to Siyathokoza's question around what needs to happen for South Africa to catalyze change. I think how do we sort of convince government to do things differently? And I think my answer to that, Siyathokoza, is that I think we have to start from the premise that South Africa is willing to and is open to the idea of changing and adapting and actually, becoming better and doing better. I think there's a lot of constraints around how it is able to do that effectively. I think previous sort of interventions have spoken about the capacity constraints, in terms of the skills of the leadership skills of diplomats, the bureaucratic sort of nature in which decisions are taken, all of those things. So I think those issues I think need to be addressed and need to be overcome. But I think very simplistically, I would probably say that also there is a role to be played by people like yourself and people like me, right, in the space of civil society. That a few months ago, we were on a panel discussion about South African foreign policy, and somebody said, we are the people that we're hoping to, we're the people that we're waiting for to change, right? To change our society. And so that for me, that really stuck with me. It's that actually we are the ones that need to be able to ask for the change, to push for that change. We really need to consider in terms of our own mandate, what it is that we're doing, and how do we engage government more? We need to bring them to the table if they're not the ones willing to be, if they're displaying that reluctance. So yeah, I mean, I think it is just sort of advocating for that that greater agency from our side. We're not passive observers, and we're not victims to whatever it is that the South African government, or agentless without, to the South African government's approaches. I think we are a powerful voice. We also have media, and so we need to be able to harness those effectively.
Thank you, Aditi. I'm going to go to the next round of questions. I recognize Ellen, Priyal, and I think Susanna, I don't know if you want to add any more. I think Gustavo has answered your question, but if you want to add any more, just let me know. And then we can do Toyin as well. So I'm going to ask Ellen to start. Just kind of tell us your affiliation and where you're based.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm based in Germany, and I'm a doctoral student at BIXUS in Bavaria. Thank you, first of all, to both speakers for these fruitful insights and ideas. It was really interesting for me to listen. And my question is sort of basic. So I was wondering what some of the key issues could be that South Africa should tackle as part of the AU to position not only the AU, but also South Africa as a political security player to be reckoned with internationally. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Priyal.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi.
Hi panel. This is Priyal from the ISS. Sanusha, I got very excited when you mentioned that there's participants or there's attendees from the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee who are listening in on this conversation. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to hear from the panel their thoughts on a reinvigorated South African approach to bilateral peace and security interventions around the continent. And of course, I'm asking this in the context of recent developments regarding the ARF and the development partnership bill that is being processed through Parliament at the moment. And I feel there's a bit of a disjuncture between South Africa's multilateral rhetorical commitments and what South Africa does bilaterally in backstopping its commitments with material resources, with hard interventions and initiatives. So I just wanted to ask that question to the panel as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those of us who don't know what ARF is the African Renaissance Fund. And in particular, how important that fund is in terms of South Africa's soft power and development agency with regard to formalizing a structure around that. I'm going to go now to Toyin and ask him or her, sorry, to ask their question.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
This is Toyin Adetiba from University of Zululand in KZN. You know, the topic is very interesting, though. Unfortunately, I want to deviate a bit. You know, my question is based on this issue of COVID-19. You know, I'm thinking that what would be the stand of South Africa post COVID-19 vis-a-vis its foreign policy? That's my question.
Okay, thank you. So let me revert to the panel. I don't know, Aditi, do you want to start, Gustavo? I'm also very keen to understand the African Renaissance Fund going forward, particularly in terms of its construction, identity, and institutional architecture, in terms of whether how it transforms into the South African Development Partnership Agency, and more so also, Gustavo, around the questions you raised with regard to the PSC, sorry, within the AU, and what role that would actually have within an African Renaissance Fund, envisioning that we can't ignore that this fund, and in particular a formalized agency, could be quite a critical space for COVID diplomacy or pandemic diplomacy. I think is really an important discussion to be had outside of the normal stance of what peace and security interventions and agendas are. So, Gustav, you want to start? I think.
Sorry, I was confused who was going to go now. Thanks for these questions, and I'll try to kind of bring them together because I think they are quite interrelated. The issue around what issues can South Africa bring and what is the role of bilateral, what is the role of the different funding mechanisms, I think they all link a bit to the type of role that South Africa itself wants to play. And I'll explain what I mean here. I think we often mention the Mbeki era, and it was kind of obvious at times that at those times, South Africa being very willing to punch above its weight. So as a middle power with important relevance, but really elevating its voice, almost reflecting what we would say countries like Sweden or Norway play from a northern point of view, countries that are fairly small, sizable, but still are able to have something that they bring to the table. And I think what we see at the moment and what I find at the moment is that it increasingly, rather than punching above the weight, is South Africa wanting to play by the rules. So to some extent, measuring in its own roles, it believes in multilateralism, it believes in a rules-based system, but it's not really trying to do everything and to do partially, I think, because we are in a different period. I think we are in a very different period what we were 10, 15 years ago, but also in terms of its own capacity from a budgetary point of view and ability of actually putting their money where the mouth is. And I think that has a lot to do, and I'm kind of disappointed that Priyal asked more of a question than a comment, because Priyal is just finishing a really interesting paper now specifically on South Africa's engagements on funding mechanisms. So I will just share some of my own views and just maybe a shameless promotion that keep an eye. Priyal is bringing a really good paper in the next coming weeks on that. But I think the issue of the ARF and African Renaissance Fund and the transformation towards the South Africa Development Partnership Agency, it's very indicative of this kind of challenges around our own bilateral interactions, and particularly when it comes to peace and security matters. Because there is that kind of, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily the amounts. I think the amounts are comparable to other developing countries, what they would do in terms of bilateral cooperation. But for me, it's more in terms of the consistency and the types of engagements that are done. Whereas in terms of we using those initiatives to promote longer term goals, do we know what the results they are, or are we simply trying to win hearts and minds? And I don't think there is a problem with neither of them. I think and I see a lot of colleagues that are present here that are from development partnership agency, from different embassies. And there is a role for all of them in terms of the direct results you'd like to see, but also in terms of gaining visibility. But I think to some extent that inconsistency of engagements of the ARF, the inability of fully transforming and creating a South African Development Partnership Agency has a lot to do with, if you ask me, if we are to remain with the status quo, it's very unlikely for me that the ARF will have a really big role when it comes to broader continental issues of peace building, peace and security, and so on. Very punctual, very direct, and very much based on very specific issues that South Africa sees as priorities. But I think that it's this kind of also shows a bit how South Africa juggles the different levels. And I think those multiple hats that I was mentioning in the beginning around being part of SADC, being part of this, often South Africa plays those in a way to kind of, well, we're part of all of them. Let's have a very multilateralism is important, but we're not that active through those. And the example that I wanted to give is DRC in January 2019. It was in the post-election crisis in the DRC and the role that South Africa played in the AU, but also played in the UN. The speeches often were quite vague, quite general. They're not bad, but it was just very, very general. And one of the explanations we received in having why was that the case is that some people told us, like, well, but the DRC is mostly a bilateral matter to South Africa. So in their understanding, their how they would interact with players in the DRC were much more from a bilateral point of view than they would from multilateral organizations. But then it means, okay, what can we directly expect South Africa to do when it comes to AU matters in the coming years? And I think that it's a very important question from Eileen. And I would highlight 4 big issues here that I think that South Africa could really play a difference. One is advancing the discussions on funding, because we are talking about the ARF and SADP, but there is a major crisis when it comes to UN-AU relations around predictability and sustainability of funding. South Africa did try in August last year to table a resolution that would be presented in the presidency month to try to advance the discussions around that and the use of UN budgets or UN assessed contributions to Africa Union missions. And there was a fallback from the PSC itself. And therefore, South Africa never really tabled that resolution. But I do think that this is one of the issues, and particularly how the revitalized African Peace Fund, right now, I believe it has already gathered around $180 million US, which is not a neglectable amount of money. And how are we going to see that, particularly when we are in a incoming new United States administration? Actually, surprisingly, it's the first time we mentioned the US in this conversation, because it will be a very important issue, how the US will see the future of peace operations, how the US will see the future of funding of peace operations, but also how South Africa uses its own tools within this very complex environment of funding of peace and security initiatives. The second one, I think it's South Africa being much more active in this discussion of the future of peacekeeping itself. I think both the AU and the UN are in a changing environment on how they see peacekeeping. There is a reduced pressure from members, there's a reduced appetite from member states to deploy very big peacekeeping operations like MONUSCO or AMISOM in Somalia. And more what we're seeing is this smaller, more targeted, low-key, often political missions that have lower cost but have a very different way of approaching. But also that increasingly regional and continental organizations are deploying operations outside of the context of peacekeeping. That is the case of the G5 Sahel or MNJTF dealing with the Boko Haram, which they don't quite fit the context of and the definition of peacekeeping operations, but they are authorized and mandated by both the Peace and Security Council of the African Union and the UN Security Council, which means that really difficult questions around command and control, reporting, funding, all of those things are still kind of very much up in the air. And if we see now in the discussion that we had yesterday in the Security Council, increasingly the African Union becoming part of these types of operations, utilizing even surprisingly, and we had a long Twitter discussion yesterday amongst many of us from the ISS around the use of what seemed almost dead, the African Standby Force, that it seems that it's going to be one of the deploying mechanisms for the newly deployed troops that will be sent to the G5 Sahel. But the final thing is how South Africa can use 2 of its big stated priorities in the African Union more wisely and to be more present in them. One is peace building, where South Africa is often pushing for that agenda, but I think from the African Union point of view, it's still the weakest link of the African Union generally. It is an emerging area. There is a new center to be created in Egypt, Cairo. But there's still much more questions about what really is the AU expected to do when it comes to peace building. And I think a member state like South Africa should really be active on that. And the final one relates to the issue of mediation. Mediation is often mentioned as this really big thing for South Africa, for multilateral organizations. And I think the process of building the capacity of the regional organizations, the Africa Union Mediation Support Unit, the SADC Mediation Support Unit, the South Africa ON-led Mediation Support Unit, and really making sure that those structures that are being developed are heavily supported by member states like South Africa. If we don't do that, we're still going to have mediation and preventive diplomacy that is done in an ad hoc manner, in a piecemeal manner, that is inconsistent and often entirely based on the character of the mediator himself or herself. And I think with the professionalization of our field, a country like South Africa is always the champion that we're looking to have, but we still, I think, would like to see South Africa being a bit more active at the AU level, regional SADC, and at the national level when it comes to that. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic, Gustavo. And I appreciate you bringing the US into the room, because I think that was going to be my follow-up in terms of where we're going in the context of other regions and so forth. Aditi, do you want to add anything?
Well, actually, I want to abuse my position at the mic to ask
Priyal
to answer his own question, seeing as Gustavo has already hinted at the fact that he already has the answers. He's the expert in the room. So if we can, and then I'd like to also just quickly respond to some of the questions.
Okay, maybe you want to respond and then Priyal will answer his own question.
Okay, all right, I can do that. No, it is very quickly is to say, I think that, Eileen asked a very good question around what are the key issues within the AU that South Africa should be pushing for in order to sort of reconnect it sort of internationally. And I think from my current hat, I would actually like to say that there's a systemic issue that I think that links a lot to the complexities that Gustavo has talked about relating to the ability of the African Union to respond to peacekeeping, peace building, mediation challenges on the continent. And I think that there is a real need for that at a systemic level to address those issues, because what I'm observing in dealing with conflicts on the African continent is the almost systematic marginalization of the African Union, where I feel as an African analyst, as an African citizen, I feel that the AU should actually take a more central role in peacekeeping and peace building efforts. Is not, principally because it is not well resourced. It hasn't actually taken the step beyond having making decisions and then actually sort of implementing those decisions. So I think that the AU in itself needs to be bolstered so that it can effectively deal with the kinds of conflicts that we're talking that are so worrying for the continent, the Sahel, Mali, the peace process that is so necessary in Mali. We've talked about Cameroon, Sudan, South Sudan. So all of these issues, I think, really actually stem from that perspective.
Thank you, Aditi. Priyal, you've got a task at hand.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot, Aditi. I guys did answer the question. I think my very brief comment that I'll make is that, with this administration and where we are right now in the country, I always go back to the president's early speech where he outlined the theme of renewal and recalibration. And I think that's the overarching theme of this administration. It's a theme and it's a goal, and it's something that we can see has influenced a lot of different South African government processes. It has seeped into our foreign policy. But unfortunately, we just haven't seen this when it comes to peace and security. Although we have South Africa on the Security Council as chair of the African Union, we just haven't seen adequate reference being made to peace and security issues. We haven't seen adequate bilateral interventions or initiatives. We haven't seen this really reinvigorated push to push through all of these reforms and changes that we need. I think Aditi mentioned a bit earlier that we're still working off a white paper that is many, many years old now. And although we've had the foreign policy review that is absolutely welcome in the sense that it made the acknowledgement that we have slipped in the world. Our position of influence and power has declined. So it's great to get that official government acknowledgement. But there's two further things. The one is we need a new white paper or something like that just brings us back up to date on what we want, where we want to be in the world, what our bilateral approaches needs to be and how these needs to align to our multilateral commitments. The second thing is halfway done. The Foreign Service Act has been pushed through. That's very encouraging. It was many years in the making, and that gives me a sense of hope that this development partnership bill, although many of my colleagues disagree with me, is a sign to be optimistic that we might see attention on reinvigorating, that we are slowly headed in that direction. But I think where we stand right now at the end of 2020, there's still much more work that needs to be done by South Africa on reinvigorating its prioritization of African peace and security issues. I'll stop there. Thanks.
I mean, I thanks, Priyal, and of course we're looking forward to reading the policy brief. But I also think that if you look at the Sahel and you look at North Africa and you look at that region above the equator, it's quite a crowded region of actors, and with very specific interests and geopolitical interests. And so I would think that you are quite right in in arguing that how much does the white paper need to be updated, not necessarily around what South Africa does, but to understand who the players are in this region, what their intentions are, what their goals are, and what their objectives are, and how that complicates or creates a complex system in terms of how do you then push forward the kind of AU peace and security intervention based on the 4 points that Gustav had recommended. I think it really makes us wonder to what extent are we updating what is a moving target in Africa, to a large extent that we are not up, in a sense that we need to be much more engaging as opposed to trying to say the world is in this context or this lens. But unfortunately, even in Southern Africa, the question I would raise around Mozambique is, does Mozambique want South Africa's help? And that's another question that needs to be asked, because I think the question of subsidiarity around SADC and of course within the AU is it enough to just say, I want people in the bureaucracy in the PSC? A question is, what do you do in that PSC? And more importantly, how do you link? How do you create a link, an orbit between Pretoria and what you're doing in the AU? So just a few points around what was coming out from the discussion. But thank you, Priyal, for contextualizing and giving us a perspective on these issues. I have two more people. I'm going to recognize Joharul and allow Joharul to speak. He has some interesting points about Cyril Ramaphosa's style of decision making. So you go ahead, and then afterwards we'll have Sajeev and Darren. Sorry. And I'm not sure if Joharul can hear us. Can you hear us? It looks like he's having a bit of a connection problem. Maybe I'll go to Sajeev. Sajeev, welcome. And CUTS is an incredible institution. Sajeev. I think we're having some connection problems. So let me go to Darren and ask him to raise his point, question, and so forth.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Great. It's Darren Bergman from the Parliamentary Portfolio. I've been listening very interestingly with, to the whole panel, and I always find it, coming from the SADC background and the parliamentary background, I always find it interesting to find how others perceive us both internally and externally. Internally, I often find that South Africa's foreign policy is sometimes a bit bipolar in the sense that we have what's on paper and then we have what's in practice. And when I say what's in practice, we've often had those embarrassing moments where diplomats have been allowed onto airplanes and been able to leave, or, there's been some diplomatic spats where there's been those allegations that, of some assaults, etc., etc. But problematic to me now is we've had opportunities, and it's been mentioned now with Morocco. We've had opportunities with the UN, and we've had the opportunity with the AU. And we're making a very important play for a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. So we really want to do what's right by having a seat both at the UN and the AU, by making a productive session at these two councils. Now, with those two seats we've had with COVID-19 has brought us an opportunity. Obviously, it's brought us challenges, but it's also brought us opportunities. Now, the problem is that under COVID, a lot of our African leaders, unfortunately, have taken the cover of COVID to, I don't want to say steal elections, but be very creative with the elections. So you've mentioned a lot of the security problems, but we've also had election problems. We've had the elections in Zanzibar, in Guinea, Uganda. We've got even upcoming, we've got tricks coming up in Zambia, and we've even had the elections in Ivory Coast. Now, all these areas have been problematic. And this again has required AU leadership. Now, Aditi again has said very cleverly that we require AU leadership, not just resources. You just require a mouth. You require a mouthpiece. You require dialogue. You require someone to stand out strongly and denounce what is taking place. And no one is saying it. Even if they filter it through the north, the west, the east, and the south channels and say, what's happening is wrong, or, we must not use the COVID-19 as a cover, we're still not hearing it. And then you've still got these issues. And Shirisha, you said it now, that you're not so sure that Mozambique wants our help. Now, as a political analyst, what's behind that? Is that possibly that there might be a political historic spat between South Africa and Mozambique, which has led us to believe that maybe Mozambique is not really necessarily opening their hands to welcome us into this problem. But we've also got to ask ourselves at this stage, we're very quick to call it terrorism, and we're very quick to say that what's happening in Mozambique, of course it is dire trouble at this stage, but I'm worried now, and I say this very carefully and very cautiously, but when we talk about what's happening in the north of Mozambique, are we not talking about potentially a civil war? Because we're talking about groups of people that live within the boundaries of Mozambique that are two different tribes within Mozambique. And if it's a civil war, we've got to be careful that it's not classified or downplayed or becomes a Mozambique problem and then brushed only to be a Mozambique problem or brushed to only be an African problem or SADC problem. We need it to be, we need to be sure that it's never spun or politicized into one aspect. So I would just like your opinions as to when we say resource, we've got to be careful. I mean, this afternoon is going to be question time in Parliament, and we're talking about the Pan-African Parliament and the housing it in South Africa. And again, we're going to be talking about resources upon resources and another parliament for Africa. And you're going to ask for more resources. And this is going to be possibly another talk shop. And we're going to have, but what we need now is leadership and consistency. And SADC is working on something called the role model law. And I think what we need is for the AU to take that role model law and roll it out to the whole of Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren. I think you've really opened up an important context around just structural conditions in the region. And more importantly, the question of how do we interpret what's happening in northern Mozambique? And rightly so, is it a civil war? Is it a resource war? Is it a question of exclusion? And what Mary Calder at LSE calls new wars, new types of wars, or new topologies of war, because for years of being excluded and being cut off from Maputo and the south, you've got this incredible building up of tension within that corridor. And unfortunately, the resource or the LNG just adds another layer of complexity to the whole tension there in terms of what's going on. But also you've got private security. You've got the Mozambique Defense Force, which seems to be according to some reports, seems to be weak. They, that what's happening on the ground is that the soldiers on the ground are ill-equipped, don't have the capacity to deal with what people are, some are calling it insurgency. I like the term that Piers Pigot makes at International Crisis Group, where he calls it a media jihadist, because it's the way it plays into those dynamics. But I think what is really important for us to bear in mind as South Africa, as South Africans, and about understanding our own region, is the question of vulnerability, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, all to do with exclusion of communities from being able to have a clearer and a more equitable distribution of resources in the region. And it is in that context, I think we have to also think about what is the role of South Africa in Mozambique. The reason I made the tongue-in-cheek point about does Mozambique want South Africa there is particularly because it seems to me that the other players are back in the fold. I mean, you have France in the fold in Mozambique, the EU, etc. And we have a regional organization that should be doing this, particularly in the plan that you mentioned, and what that protocol is. So I think we really have to start thinking about another more critical factor, which I don't see Gustav on, but definitely one that he put into play in his discussion, and that was the U.S. the incoming presidency of President-elect Biden, and what expectations should we have of a Biden presidency to ask the question, the role that the U.S. will be playing in Africa. And there's been all disparate interpretations that on the one hand, don't expect too much. On the other hand, there'll be key issues like climate change, questions around pandemic diplomacy and global health security and so forth. But I also think that at a time where the rest of the world is looking at their own regions and trying to define how to deal with geostrategic and geosecurity questions, both born out of interstate conflict, intrastate conflict, but also development and human security security dimensions and conflict, and refugee crises and displacement, and what we now call climate refugees. I think the leadership, the continent is looking for that leadership, and it will be interesting to see how South Africa plays that role in moving forward with a group of countries that talk about the collective. Because we're not looking to the US, we're not looking to the EU, development cooperation and development assistance is not going to come in the way that we have envisaged before. And of course, questions are going to be raised about how we borrow, who we borrow from, and the impact this is going to have on our current deficits and so forth. So I think at this point in time, I'd like to offer Aditi a closing remark. I'd like to offer Gustav a closing remark, and then I'll bring it to an end. I'll bring the two questions in, Aditi and Gustav. I think you can see it on the Q&A panel. The one being how much is Cyril's consultative style of decision making should be looked at in the context of foreign policy. And then, of course, the other kind of bigger question he raises is the destruction of Thuli House as a result of factional battle? So he's asking us, can we ignore what's happening domestically and how it affects our foreign policy? And of course, Sajeev is asking again, Gustav, about priorities that you listed in terms of US reform. And I think you've answered US security reform, rather. That was not intended about US reform. But I think you've answered that in terms of looking beyond just the Security Council. So I'll give you the floor, and we can end, and I'll hand back to Irina.
Shall I go first, Gustavo?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Anyone? Yeah.
No, I think maybe just to say that I love my new hat, because my new hat allows me to be a little bit more provocative than I have been in the past, and sort of maybe just. What I've been wanting to do, Sanusha, is challenge the sort of sentiment that you posed, which is does Mozambique want South Africa in to intervene? And my answer from the perspective of, if you're looking at the humanitarian concerns of Mozambique, I would say it's not actually a case of what Mozambique what the government of Mozambique wants. It's actually what is in the interest of of the citizens, what's in the interest of the sort of broader regional security. And I think that it poses an unique opportunity for South Africa to repivot towards this notion of protecting human security. Again, lots of skepticism around its willingness to do so, lots of skepticism around its past performance and the fact that it hasn't actually. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the sort of thing that is the sort of answer that comes top of mind. I think, and then I think going into the issues around it, I think maybe rather than speaking about Luthuli House specifically, I think very much my introductory comments, the intervention was very much trying to illustrate how the domestic concerns of South Africa have a palpable impact on our foreign policy. And I think we're at a point 26, 27 years after democracy, or after 1994, we're at a point we've undertaken all of these reviews to assess what is our position in the world. We really have to have a clear sense of actually, there's disjuncture between the various values that we espouse. The values that we espouse in our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, our, and our commitment to human security on the one hand, versus our identities that we adopt in the international space, which is the sort of the issue of multilateralism, the need to have consensus decisions, the sort of solidarity with the global South. These are spaces where we've seen over the past few years how these fissures are growing, and how it is no longer enough to have to make sweeping pronouncements around priorities and where we want to be in the world. We actually have to dig into that nuance, and we have to interpret that nuance and implement based on that nuance. I think the world is expecting us to, and it would be remiss of us to not use that opportunity.
Thanks, Aditi. Just before you provide your comments, Gustav, we have the content advisor from the parliamentary committee who, I apologize, I missed your hand. Dineo, do you want to just kind of ask your question? And
okay, thank you, Sanusa, and good morning to everyone. Mine, it's just to maybe give a bit of information in terms of the ARF, the processes around the ARF and SATPA. Just to say, the SATPA bill is not yet before Parliament, and it's not going to be a SATPA bill as such. What the department is having on their strategic plan is what is called a Partnership for Development Bill, which is going to repeal the ARF Act so that it replaces the ARF, and then that Partnership for Development Bill will be the one that will be processed by Parliament at a later stage. It is not before Parliament as we speak. Then the cabinet decision of 2009 in terms of the establishment of SATPA is still on the table, and the committee is, on a regular basis, actually each and every report of the committee talks to the department, having to implement this decision and make sure that there is an agency which will act as soft power for South Africa's foreign policy, but this has not yet happened. So I thought maybe I should just clarify that. And indeed, with regard to the white paper of 2011, the committee has also called for an update of the white paper, or just for the department to revisit, because a lot of issues which influence South Africa's foreign policy have happened, and the white paper was developed in 2011. So we are in 2020. So there is a need to revise the white paper. So these are the two issues which I wanted to highlight to the gathering. Thanks, Sanusha.
Thank you, Dineo, and thank you for giving us that very, very important information about the role that the committee is playing as well in terms of oversight and asking for an update with regard to where things are, and also to keep what I think is a moving target constant, if you can, because it's such a fluid space right now. Gustav, let me hand over to you. Closing remarks.
I would try to be very brief because I know we're a bit over time, but I just wanted two brief comments. One from Juhairo's question, and because I think it's still a very important one around the epicenters of foreign policy, and the second one about the role of parliament. That I'm really, really excited there is parliamentary committees here, and I'll explain that now. But I think in terms of foreign policy and where the epicenters are, I think there is also the elements that for many years in South Africa we were asking ourselves, is there really a clear foreign policy in South Africa? And I think that very passive role that we had as a country for many years, it felt to me and to many that are following foreign policy of that standard decision sometimes is a no decision. So we're going to make some big decisions that are coming either from the presidency or from DIRCO or from Luthuli House, but often there is that disengagement with issues altogether, which I think is part of what my answer to Juhairo's question, that I think the 2 points about Cyril certainly plays a role. The internal issues and factionalisms within the ANC plays a role. But there's the simple fact that there is this untapped a role that many actors that were fairly quiet for many years now are back into the game, whether it's parliament, whether it is in DIRCO and so on, but also civil society. I think Aditi mentioned a bit about that. I think we have a long way to go, but it's really nice as a part of South African civil society to see where you're not necessarily seen as opposition if you're criticizing government. And I think there is a very fine balance between that you can disagree with government and still have a conversation with governments about this in a quite a mature way. And I think that it's part of what I would hope to see foreign policy in South Africa evolving to, where those different players are kind of almost like different pull and pushes, that at some point the results are actually different than what of the actors individually would do, which brings me to my final point, and I think is the really important role for not only of parliament, but we as think tanks and civil society should give to parliament too. I find for many of us based in Gauteng, we tend to see the executive as our in and out point. We look into what is happening at DIRCO, we look what is happening at the union buildings, and I don't know if it's a geographical thing, but there is definitely an element of a dominance of what is happening in Gauteng as what we consider to be definitive in terms of foreign policy. And I think we do, ISS, IGD, Crisis Action, SIRE, Accord, all of us that are part of these civil society organizations working on these issues have a responsibility to interact more with the parliamentary committee. Because I find and I regularly reads the procedures of parliament and it's, if parliaments are better informed about something, the discussions are fantastic. They're really, really good, and they kind of ask the right questions. But very often I find that the parliament itself is not so well informed, which means that the questions and the checks and balances that they're doing for the executive and for different parts of government are also quite underwhelming, because then you start asking questions about what is really the UN and what is the Security Council, so I think from our side, and having the advantage of South African civil society and think tanks amongst some of the best in the world when it comes to that type of analysis. And I do think that we need to be more active. We need to reach out to them more. I think we need to be a bit less Gauteng centric and to focus a bit more on really important political discussions that is happening in parliaments in Cape Town. So I think for those of you of parliaments that are still here, just from ISS side, we're probably going to be knocking at your doors. And I hope that orders like IGD, Action, SIRE, and everyone that works on foreign policy issues.
Thank you, Gustav. I think you've really put it into context now that the foreign policy community is not only within the centric ambit of the executive. I mean, I like the fact that you brought in Parliament. And I think we're also going to recognize other sub-national actors. I think Aditi's role with the advocacy of civil society, track 1, track 2, track 1.5, diplomacy. I mean, we have to basically start gathering this information, not in silos, but start sharing this information in a much more collective and in a way that actually helps to build a knowledge production center of what the issues are and what's happening. So thank you very much to Aditi and Gustav. You've given us a lot of food for thought. Basically, I think you've opened up important issues around bureaucracy, about reform of not just the UN, the multilateral system, the role of the AU, capacitating South African foreign policy to be able to also have an important linkage and relationship to the AU, understanding the structural changes that are happening in the world and in the continent, within our regional neighborhood, but also saying to other actors who may not have this kind of information at hand, to say that we are willing to work with you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Arina, just to say that Arina has shared 2 of our previous South Africa in the World reports on the panel, but also from this, I think it's been streamed live on YouTube. So at some point you'll have a YouTube video that you can go back if you've missed some of the points that we made, and there will be a report that will be shared with everyone. And hopefully our next South Africa in the World will look at some of the key issues around roles like BRICS, IPSA, and more importantly with relations in Asia Pacific, as well as in North America and Europe.
Thanks, Sanusha. I hope my connection is going to be okay. Over the last, few moments, it's been rather spotty, but let me try a roundup. I mean, this is our annual flagship project, and we're incredibly proud of it. And earlier this year, what we tried to do is we wanted to explore more about the party-state dynamics and to really look at some of the scenarios that have come up. ISS has done quite a bit of work on scenarios, so has the Institute for Race Relations, and also MISTRA. They have also done quite a bit of work on scenarios as well. So what we did was a scenario building exercise in this regard, and to really look at how the domestic environment is impacting, what is the synergy between the domestic and international, and how is it going to impact, on our foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of it, we said, well, South Africa is likely going to muddle through this year. I don't know if I could say that for sure, looking back on the year. Have we muddled through? Have we exceeded expectations? A bit of a mixed batch, I think. But if I was to come back to this kind of question I had at the beginning of the webinar to ask, what can we expect from South Africa over the next 10 years? It's 2020, let us look to 2030. And if I may presume, just to leave you with a few thoughts, South Africa leaving the United Nations Security Council, as Gustavo mentioned, maybe is going to feel it's not as an important actor anymore, which is actually where it needs to strike hardest. It is at the end of the day located in Africa. And as Aditi was mentioning, we have this kind of disconnect from the value system that we want to project. And this is where the greater challenge South Africa is going to face over the next 10 years. How is it going to interact, with these values, with its history? And how is it going to make these decisions going forward, especially given, this long list of roadmaps and policies that it has to work with as well. So this comes into its mediator role. It's going to play quite a bit of role, quite a strong role in its positioning as a mediator, in its ability to have certain conversations. And so not to forget those values is incredibly important, perhaps. This also comes to the coordinating funding and financing mechanisms, which will always come back as a predominant factor in operations, in engagements. And lastly, with COVID-19 taking the world by storm in 2020, and this growth of pandemic diplomacy that we are going to actually start seeing, where health emergencies, even climate change emergencies, they are going to start signifying even greater shifts in our human security thinking. going forward. But overall, I'm looking forward to having more conversations, less geographically charged as well. And yeah, just to wrap up, I know the passcode has not worked for a few people. Hopefully that's been okay and you've been able to still join us on YouTube. If not, it will be sent to you. And thank you to our guests for staying with us for so long. Thank you from IGD, the team, panelists, and especially the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for partnering with us. And later on, we actually have another event coming up. Hope to see you there. Thanks so much. Bye.